Stop now. Go in a different direction. We'll have the other day on the march.
I mean, she does, but not much. She's crazy about it. I'm not giving my card. So you can find me.
Have on the topic of political reconciliation. The first we'll look at it through the perspective of international affairs. And the second, the American domestic scene. We have our own reconciliation issues here in this country as the partisan polarization grows. And then the last session will be on the media. And we've got, for that session, we've got three different people who will be part and presenting kind of the media's role, what's happening with the media in different ways. We designed this to be a discussion. And so no one's going to stand up and lecture for 45 minutes. We'll start it, and our main speaker will kind of frame some issues just to get the discussion going. And then we'd like to have you join in. And in joining in, kind of no speechifying. You can make a point, so that's certainly permissible, and questions. But what we'd like to do is to try in the time we have to get as many voices into the discussion as we can. There's another group coming, that's why we've been sort of waiting. So when they come, they'll probably have to kind of figure out how to make their way into some chairs, and it'll be slightly disruptive, but not that disruptive. So, and our first speaker today is a colleague of mine, Steve Walt, who's the Belfair professor at the Kennedy School. We lured Steve away from the University of Chicago in 1999. I don't think he knew at the time that we had a kind of larger design on his time. He wasn't there very long before he became the academic dean. And to me, that is the most important and most difficult of any of the positions in a school the size of the Kennedy School. We have 150 faculty, and so Steve is in charge of 150 people who think no one is in charge of them, right? Which is what faculty are all about. But all of them make demands, and so you're in this position where you're kind of not controlling all that much, and you've got this flood of demands facing you. But so we got Steve early, maybe before he kind of understood the full burden of that position. But Steve is an internationally recognized expert in the area of international affairs. He's written widely. One of his books won a prestigious award. The other one is even rarer. Another one is even rarer by academic standards. Scholars don't ordinarily get on the New York Times bestseller list, but Steve is one of them. So, Steve Walt.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I want to thank Florentine Center, Tom, and my friend Tran for the invitation to be here. And I'm going to say just a few words about how I see the role of reconciliation in international affairs, just to kick off a discussion. I want to make 5 very quick points. The first point is just to underscore how important this issue is in international politics. If you look at the historical record, or you even look at certain contemporary policy issues, this issue of reconciliation looms quite large. After World War II, the rapid reconciliation between the United States and both Germany and Japan, and the eventual reconciliation of Germany and much of Europe, was absolutely critical to how the Cold War played out subsequently. The European Union, in some respects, is everyone's model of reconciliation. And the footnote I would add there is it also, you might notice that that reconciliation might not necessarily be permanent. Now that the European Union is having some problems, people are now resurrecting the past in various ways. If you watch the way Greeks talk about Germans and Germans talk about Greeks, you find that perhaps the reconciliation we've seen is not as firmly cast as we might have thought. The point is, it was clearly a very important development. By contrast, the absence of genuine reconciliation in the former Yugoslavia was one of the critical ingredients that led it to break apart when the Cold War came to an end. Third example, the United States and Iran have been at odds with each other for at least 30 years. Some would say for more like 50 years, depending on how you want to look at it, based on a set of historical grievances that go back decades. And earlier this year, the South Korean government was rocked when it signed an intelligence sharing agreement with Japan based on lingering Korean resentment of Japan's colonial role more than 60 years ago. And this forced the resignation of the Deputy National Security Advisor in South Korea as well. So my point here is just that reconciliation, or the absence of reconciliation, can have huge effects in world politics. Second point, it's, I think, just interesting to note that the obstacles to reconciliation don't seem to have any direct connection to the absolute level of harm or damage that was inflicted. It's not the case that the nastier the conflict was, the harder it is to reconcile. Again, Japan reconciled with the United States at the end of World War II relatively quickly, even though we had firebombed dozens of Japanese cities and dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. By contrast, I would argue the United States has done far less real damage to Iran, which is not to say we haven't done any, but far less real damage, yet that seems to be a relationship where it's been impossible to try and bridge the differences despite occasional efforts on both sides. You might argue that a country like Serbia seems to hang on to a level of historical resentment that may be slightly out of proportion to the harms they've suffered over the past 5 or 6 or 7 centuries or so. So what I'm suggesting here is it's not just what actually occurred between 2 or more peoples. It's also how that experience has been recorded, been remembered, been repeated over and over. And one other question is whether there are groups within particular societies that might have an interest in keeping the conflict going even when others are trying to smooth it over again. Third point, the major issue here is the whole question of apologies. Right? To what extent will the perpetrators of past misdeeds acknowledge them and try to atone for them, or at least indicate that they're sorry? Apologies matter, because if one side won't admit it did anything wrong, the other side will naturally wonder if they might do something like that again if they ever had the opportunity. An apology is a way of acknowledging the other side's humanity, their equal status. When a country refuses to apologize for misdeeds, they're in effect saying, well, we don't need to apologize because either we didn't do anything wrong or we're better than you and we don't have to acknowledge what we've done in the past. There's a very nice example, by the way, of an effective apology, and that's Anwar Sadat's speech in the Knesset in Jerusalem back in 1978. If you read the text of the speech, what's very interesting is he's not asking for forgiveness. He's not really apologizing, but he's acknowledging that Egypt did some things wrong. He also makes it very clear he thinks Israel had done things to Egypt as well. So he's not groveling at all, but he is acknowledging that there has been suffering on both sides and wrongdoing on both sides. By the way, it was also a credible apology because for Sadat to do this was obviously very risky, and ultimately is one of the reasons he was subsequently assassinated. Final point on apologies. Apologies are also somewhat tricky. That is to say, you can't necessarily solve a conflict by simply having the leader issue some kind of public apology. There's a terrific book on this subject written by a scholar at Dartmouth, Jennifer Lind. The book is called Sorry States. And she points out that sometimes efforts at apologizing actually backfires and makes things worse. A leader may try to apologize, but sometimes that can trigger an enormous domestic backlash, right? The apology then fails because so many people in the leader's own country object to the apology that the person or the state they're apologizing to says, well, actually that country is even worse than we thought. The leader tried to apologize and his society or her society wouldn't let them. So apologies by themselves are actually a much trickier problem. By the way, you see this here in the United States today, where at times President Obama is accused by Republicans of apologizing too often for the United States, suggesting that the domestic politics of trying to say you're sorry are quite tricky. Point number 4, there are a variety of other ways that states can try to promote reconciliation that are independent of issuing formal apologies. Or there are certain conditions that make reconciliation somewhat easier. The obvious one, particularly from sort of my view of world politics, is when two former enemies suddenly discover that they share a common adversary, right? And they have to forgive the past in order to cooperate in the present against a common threat. Again, I think this is much of what made reconciliation somewhat easier after World War II, at least for the United States and some of its critical partners. A second way to do this is by joint commemorations for essentially memorializing the past conflict, not as a sense of one side being victims and the other side being the perpetrators, but rather making an event in which clearly all parties suffered. This is, I think, very much the way much of Europe, and particularly Western Europe, has dealt with the Second World War. When now, every time we have a major anniversary of the Second World War now, like the 50th or 60th or whatever, there are various commemorations in Europe where everyone shows up and talks about basically what a horrible experience the whole thing was, but doesn't spend a lot of time pointing fingers any longer at who is responsible. A third mechanism is joint historical investigations. Actually, instead of having politicians do it, you have academics and scholars from the different countries involved get together and try to develop a shared narrative, a shared understanding of what the past experience was really all about and what actually occurred. Or even if they don't fully agree on it, at least coming to some understanding of how it is viewed on each side. And that becomes a way in which different societies start to recognize exactly what happened. A single national leader can make bold steps to break from the past, set two or more countries on a new path. I think that can also happen within countries. Everyone's favorite example there, of course, is Nelson Mandela. And I would just add that it's not just political leaders. I think scholars and artists actually often can play critical roles here. The way they write about the past. This was clearly true, in the case of Germany, where there was a very active set of German writers in the 1950s and 1960s, writing primarily for their own countrymen and encouraging them to confront what Germany had done in the earlier part of the century. Last point, and then I will stop. I would argue, I think, that international reconciliation, although it is often quite difficult, is actually easier than reconciliation within a country. For example, reconciliation after a civil war or some kind of deep internal struggle. And the basic reason is this, that in an international conflict, after it's happened, there may be great resentment, there may be continued anger and hatred, but ultimately the two societies don't have to try and live together within the same political unit. They can, to some degree, move back to their respective corners and live their own lives. In an internal conflict, inside a particular country, whenever it's over and you're trying to promote reconciliation, you're trying to arrange a circumstance where all the members of that society ultimately can form part of a single country once again. And just to take the American example, it was at least a century since the Civil War before I would argue there was really sort of full reconciliation between the American South and the rest of the country. There are probably some people who would argue that that still hasn't been fully achieved, and that's here in the United States. So I would argue that, again, reconciliation is hard between countries. It's even harder within a country, particularly if there have been extended civil conflicts, there have been real violence, things like that. Bottom line, this is an important issue in world affairs. It's also, in my view, a fascinating topic that we still don't understand fully. I hope I have put enough out there now to provoke a discussion. I will therefore be quiet and start listening. Thanks very much.
So let me ask the first question, and we'll throw it out to the people here. You didn't mention kind of the role of third-party actors in the reconciliation process. So, you know, the book of yours with John Mersheimer that got the most attention, some unwanted. You know, there's three parties in some ways to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. The third party is the United States. And, you know, how do international relations scholars kind of look at the role of third parties?
I think in almost all these cases, third parties can often play a very critical mediating role. They can be the sort of honest brokers that help to warring or antagonistic parties come to an agreement that resolves whatever the existing differences are. The United States has not done a particularly good job of that in the Middle East context, but we have in some other contexts, and other countries have served as very effective mediators at various points in the past. I don't think third parties can do as much at reconciliation, which is a little bit different than, all right, we've reached an agreement, we understand the terms of whatever the settlement is, we've signed our peace treaty. The question is what you then do to sort of move beyond that so that there isn't a faction in one country that's wanting to open things up and refight it again. There isn't lingering suspicion. The former opponent doesn't become the object of scorn, doesn't become the object of continued recriminations. That process, I think, has to happen between the two societies directly, and in some cases within the societies, coming to terms with what they may have done in the past. And that's hard to, I think, for outsiders to do on a sustained basis. There are a couple of cases. I mean, after World War II, the United States played a pretty substantial role in trying to encourage the rewriting of history textbooks in both Europe and in Japan to try and encourage the teaching of a less nationalistic history. And that was much more successful in Europe than it ultimately was in Japan. There was some progress made, but then a lot of backsliding in the Japanese case. So I think there are real limits to what third parties can do at promoting reconciliation, although they can do a lot to maybe get the process started by bringing the conflict to an end.
So, observations, questions?
Disagreements?
Disagreements? No rotten apples, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your introduction.
Can you identify yourself?
Yes, hi, my name is Irene, and I'm a researcher, postdoctoral researcher at Harvard Law School. I was wondering when you, thank you very much. When you identified the actual recording in society of the tragic events as a substantial element in order to achieve a reconciliation, I was wondering whether the role of the media is important. That can be considered also a substantive actor in this process in order to amplify the obstacles or either to circumvent them. Thank you.
I think there's no question that media, broadly defined, play a critical role here because media contribute to sort of national narratives, the basic understanding that members of a society have of their own history and the history of those with whom they've been engaged. Some of that's done by academics writing history books, some of it's by journalists who are writing sort of more popular accounts, and some of it's done by the sort of the daily narrative you hear if you listen to the radio, if you watch television, and if you go around the country or go around the world, you often find that those same events are not reported in the same way, not described in the same way as you move from country to country to country. So I think media of all sorts is critical to all of this. And maybe I'll amend my comment or my reaction to Tom's question just slightly by saying that perhaps one place that third parties can contribute to that is if people are trying to put together sort of larger conferences to talk about, events in Indochina, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the long dispute between India and Pakistan, and you have some Indian scholars and journalists and Pakistani scholars and journalists, having some people who aren't who don't have a dog in the fight to be there as well and contribute their insights can be very helpful to try and sort of nudge the two parties towards a different understanding. Many years ago, I was on a trip in former Soviet Georgia, and there were a group of Russians from Moscow on the trip and a group of Georgians, both sets of academics. And you could spend time, you could go ask them about events in like 1921 when Russia reconquered Georgia after the Bolshevik Revolution. And you would get one set of facts and one set of accounts from the Georgian group and a completely different set of facts and a completely different account from the Russian group. And it was actually quite entertaining to go back and forth between the two groups and just ask them questions and discover that they had a completely different understanding of what had happened back in 1921.
I'm Douglas Coker with Florence Coker and Lions Foundation. With reconciliation within a country, successful reconciliation within a country, not between countries, what do you consider the most important element? What achieves successful reconciliation?
This is slightly outside.
Examples of successful reconciliation.
Yeah. This is outside my area of expertise. It's mostly sort of domestic politics question, which I don't tend to focus, but I'll toss out a couple of ideas. I think the people who have studied this process, and we've had some fellows at the Kennedy School in recent years who've looked at this, I think have learned that there is not a sort of single one-size-fits-all formula. So for example, a popular mechanism that many countries have tried to use are so-called truth and reconciliation commissions, where if there has been some form of historical injustice within a society or a civil war or whatever, and many human rights abuses, et cetera, within that society, when it's all over, you put together a truth commission and you try to go and determine what happened. This has worked reasonably well in some cases. It has not worked particularly well in others, and so the idea that you've got this universal remedy, that in every case what you need to do is simply get to the bottom of who did what, maybe with an amnesty, or maybe with some sort of punishment after the fact, but in any case, that doesn't seem to be a consistent answer. My simple response is to say that in a sense, it helps enormously if there is some way of attributing what happened to people who are no longer around. So if you can sort of blame it on a bunch of bad people who were running things who have now conveniently left the country or died, and therefore this is not intrinsic to the different factions, that can be helpful. But again, you can't count on that in every case. There must be others here who have ideas on this question, though, so please feel free to share them.
Probably not. My name is Kıvanç Ulusoy. I'm a Fulbright Fellow at the AS Center. I'm from Turkey. And just not a comment, not a question, but a kind of comment, because I was, your presentation was quite inspiring for me, because we have been now in a recent conflict with Israel. The Turkey asked apology regarding the Marmara flotilla incident that we lived 2 years ago. And Turkish Prime Minister put 3 conditions. Now one of the conditions, which is related with Gaza, is not relevant at all. So a simple apology could come from Israel, but probably they want to do, but Turkey now has a slightly different kind of position, as if Turkey doesn't want a kind of reconciliation. There's another case which you might know very well, the Armenian-Turkish reconciliation case, which is a very dramatic issue and tricky issue, and they have done a lot of things, including the one that you mentioned, you know, the historians coming together and trying to reconcile the facts, etc. So let me say, instead of contributing to reconciliation, creating a kind of frustration and also anger in Turkey. And the societies, it's very difficult to reconcile societies and their psychology. You know, I'm inspired by your presentation, but I have slightly pessimistic view about it.
Yeah. But there are two big obstacles. One is that leaders who are being pressed to issue an apology are almost certainly going to face domestic political complaints if they go along. Even if they think that this would solve the problem, as in the case you mentioned between Israel and Turkey. Nationalism is a powerful force. National pride is always there, and no one likes to see their own leaders going off and doing things with it. It has to be handled very carefully. And there's also the problem of credibility. Gee, if we apologize for this, anytime something happens that somebody doesn't like, you know, we lose someone's bags on the national airline. Am I going to have to apologize for that now, too? So people are very worried about the sort of slippery slope.
Yes.
And finally, once you apologize, you open yourself up to claims for restitution. People suddenly go, well, look, he said he was sorry. That means they probably owe us money. They ought to compensate us in other ways. It was, I believe, George Bush the elder, Bush 41, who said at one point after the United States had accidentally shot down an Iranian airline, that I'm not going to apologize for the United States of America. Right? Even though, we did not, in fact, we expressed regret. I mean, there are other names you can come up with it, but we did not formally apologize for that. We had a scholar here a few years ago who had done a study of this process by which states begin to confront their past, looking at, I think, both Japan and Turkey. And she found that there is sort of a pattern that one can see in countries, where the initial statement is, whatever we're accused of, we didn't do it. It didn't happen, right? Whoever says so is lying. And after some time and more evidence, okay, something happened, but not what we're being accused of doing. We admit something happened, but not what everyone is saying. In other words, the next stage is, okay, it happened and we did it, but we were justified, right? We were provoked into it. We had no choice. It really was, you know. And then, okay, we did it. Maybe it wasn't justified, but it really wasn't us. It was the old regime. It was a bunch of other people, right? And there's a sort of process by which countries can slowly move to finally saying, okay, it happened. We're sorry, etc. And unfortunately, it usually takes a generation or two until the people who are actually responsible are long gone.
Okay, so my name is Efrain Lazos. I'm from Mexico. I'm a Fulbright at the MIT, and I'm in philosophy. I want to touch on a slightly different point, and it's the role of the international organisms in, promoting reconciliation and peace. It seems to me that we're working with a presupposition that, conflict is not a good thing. And so we ought to avoid conflict. So that sounds very good, but I think it's probably very idealistic. You see? So my idea is that it's really better to have ways of processing conflict rather than ways of, finding remedies to ongoing conflicts. And so that's where I think that international organisms are very, very important. And, organisms, not just the UN, but I'm thinking mostly about the International Criminal Court. And I don't know if you guys have some idea why the United States doesn't belong to the International Court.
Yes. No, although I think it was the Clinton administration that was one of the original sort of sponsors of the whole idea of the criminal court. But the basic, I think, concern from an American perspective, which I'm not defending, by the way, was that given the American military role around the world, that American soldiers might ultimately end up being vulnerable to prosecution in the criminal court, and that we didn't, the American military in particular was dead set against the idea that we would sign up to some kind of international organization that would have this, in theory, capacity to do that. Now, notice that if you know how the International Criminal Court works, you could only be referred to the International Criminal Court if it was believed that you'd signed the treaty and one of your nationals had done something, major human rights abuse, genocide, etc., and the United States, in this case, refused to prosecute the person. All right, but if you think about recent events, you can understand, say the war in Iraq or a few other things like that, you can understand why some American officials or some American military officers might not like the idea that a UN employee or the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court could swoop in and say, we want to put this person on trial. And that, to me, it tells you, one of the most fundamental principles of international politics is that really powerful countries don't like to submit to larger international adjudication because they are worried that that might constrain what they're going to do. There's a larger issue. I didn't say it was right. I'm just saying it's the way it is. There's a larger issue, though, which is I think, threaded through this entire set of processes, right? And it's this question of, is it better to prosecute and punish people for wrongdoing, or is it better to just get them out of power? The debate, one of the practical debates about the International Criminal Court has been to say that, if you have a tyrant who's doing horrible things, and they know that if they ever leave power, they're then going to get arrested and be put in jail and for life, maybe they'll fight on to the end, right? And that this is you see this in the Syrian case, right? It would be a wonderful thing if Bashar al-Assad could be persuaded to step down, right? But the question is, where is Bashar going to go? And given what all that he and his regime have done in the past year or so, he would be eligible for prosecution in the ICC. So if we create a mechanism that is going to punish people, that's probably the right thing to do. It makes us feel better. Maybe it will deter people from doing things in the future. But it does create this awkward problem that if you're clinging to power and doing all sorts of barbaric things to do it, you have an incentive to just keep fighting. Because if you ever lose or ever give up, then you have a pretty ugly fate awaiting you as well. Just to make things more difficult. Yes?
Sir, my name is Tong. I run a PR agency from Vietnam. I put out an argument, maybe a counter argument for your comments and maybe for others. So the conclusion of this comment is that there's no such thing as reconciliation, because conflict happens when certain conditions happen. And then resolution happens because conditions change. So two sides have to be friends. For certain purposes, though if you apologize or you serve others' side, but for your own purpose, so people really act upon the interest to gain something from others or to gain other benefits. So there's no really real deep from the heart that people bring peace together because simply that they love each other. So I would like to have your comments and maybe for others. Thank you.
I guess, there's a part of me that wants to agree with you because it kind of fits my worldview in general, that most of world politics is driven by self-interest and not by sentiment, not by emotion. But I don't think that's quite right. I think that you do find relationships that really do change, and it's not just pure self-interest. It's not just a transaction of mutual benefit. The United States had a pretty acrimonious, even suspicious relationship with Great Britain for at least 100 years, more like 150 years after the War of Independence. The British were the world's most powerful country. They still controlled Canada. We saw them as a threat in various ways. They almost intervened in the U.S. Civil War. And if you read what Americans thought of Britain throughout the 19th century, it was not a warm, affectionate, friendly relationship. Certainly not a special relationship, right? But around about the turn of the century, the British largely decided to change that. They made a number of accommodations to the United States. I believe they did it mostly for the reasons you pointed to, that they were more worried about Germany. They wanted to have a closer relationship with the United States. But over the next century, they worked very hard, not just to have a mutually beneficial relationship, but to have a deep, warm, affectionate, we are your closest allies. Your country, in some respects, is an offshoot of England. British prime ministers work very hard at this, and there's something more to it now, I think, than just, oh, they're a useful ally to have in Europe, and oh, it's nice to have the Americans on our side. There's a tighter bond there than there was in the 19th century. So I think there's a little bit more to it than just, let's do business, even though to a first approximation, there's a lot in what you said.
What we have for the federal employee. My question is, do you have any solution for the reconciliation? For example, the people like in Vietnam, that we have the same language, same kin, but people still different. Like for after 40 years, we still see the people outside the country, inside the country, the people from the north and the south, we still have different. So do you have any case study or in your research, do you have the best solution to solve the problem, to make the people unity, happy, and living together, mutual cooperation? Thank you.
I'm going to pass on that one because I think there are other people here from Vietnam who could speak more intelligently on that question, but I'd love to hear more about it. In fact, I thought about it as I was preparing my remarks about what relations are like between the North and the South, and I know that there are still quite distinct differences, and somehow goes along with what I said about internal reconciliation often being more difficult than international. But there may be people here who have their own views on that.
Yeah. Can I take the view, please? My name is Zhang Nguyen. I'm working for the BBC World Service in London. I'm from Vietnam originally. You mentioned politics about the United States. I agree. I think in the BBC we have impartiality as one of the values for broadcasting. So that serves the purpose of at least not taking sides when you are talking about history and sometimes difficult history of the countries. But what I can offer here to my colleague from Vietnam is when I was in Poland back in the mid-1990s, there's a lesson about who take the first move to apologize. That was between the German bishops and the Polish bishops. Because under communism, it's not so easy to talk about initiatives coming out of social society. So somebody had to make the first move. And now looking at Asia, you can see I have a lot of Chinese friends, and millions of the Chinese have been angered by the visits by the Japanese leaders to Yasukuni Temple. Because they don't see it as a historical fact. They see it as something spiritually Japanese cannot overcome. And that angers the Chinese very much. So I think maybe you can mention more about the roles of religions and religious leaders in the process.
I'm just going to add something. The other tricky part in here is that past historical events are always a resource that political leaders can try to use for whatever purposes they might have today. So in the case of that you mentioned between Japan, China, and others, there's two things going on here. One is there's a legitimate set of concerns or grievances about events in the 1930s and the continued behavior and in some cases the Asian belief that Japan has not sufficiently acknowledged that. But it's also clear that the Chinese government and some other governments occasionally use that as well as a way of sort of stirring up nationalist feeling, right? And the problem is, of course, that's not something that's necessarily easy to control. Once you start referring to the past a lot, it may take on a life of its own. It may be difficult for the authorities to say, okay, that's enough anger and resentment now. Let's throttle it back again. It reminds us, it seems to me, that reconciliation is probably never 100%, right? If there's enough bad history out there, somebody can always try and resurrect it. Now, I don't think anyone is really going to bring up the Napoleonic Wars to try and attack France at this point or criticize the French, but you never know. If someone really wanted to, they might be able to say, the French have always been causing trouble in Europe, and now look what they're doing. So it's always available there to be abused, and it's often very difficult to control.
Tom Antai?
I would like to say something about the issue of Vietnam reconciliation after the war. Vietnam situation is different from other cases of reconciliation like in South Africa because the wound of the overseas Vietnamese are so recent. And the wound was caused by the victors who do not listen to the lessons of President Lincoln, who said that together we, South and North, would take care of our orphans and widows. They put a lot of enemies in the concentration camp or re-education camp. The internees lost their house, their property, maybe their wives too. And then they escaped by boat as boat refugees. So the wound is too deep and it's too recent. It's different from, say, China and Taiwan. The president of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, was Kuomintang party member who sit next to me at Harvard here when he was here as a student. He has the generosity to stick out a hand to the Chinese Communists against the Taiwanese wish. He has the daring to do that because he still have a country. But if Vietnam did not apologize for the re-education camp policy, the Vietnamese overseas would still have the recent memory of resentment. I offer the advice of apology to Ambassador Tong, who was here with Prime Minister Phan Văn Khai. She promised to bring back the suggestion to the Politburo. And the second time she met me, she even mentioned that about that apology. But maybe she did not succeed to talk with the Politburo. And somebody in the Vietnamese government told me, if you apologize for one thing, re-education camp, maybe you have to apologize for other policy wrong, such as bring down the bourgeoisie capitalism in the South, which Mr. Dong Mui himself promoted. And then I suggest ask Mr. Dong Mui, the one who is Deng Xiaoping, Vietnamese Deng Xiaoping, to do it. And then everybody will listen to him. Say, like Ho Chi Minh, he said he congratulated President Ho Dinh Diem after assassination that he's a patriot too. So let the big guy do it, and the rest of the country in Vietnam do it. Apologize for re-education camp, and then the overseas Vietnamese will no longer throw eggs and tomato and things to the diplomats of Vietnam here or around the world.
I would just comment that the United States didn't follow Lincoln's advice after the Civil War. Lincoln said some very eloquent things about how we should now re-engage the South, but that's really not what Reconstruction was ultimately all about. Lincoln, of course, had already been assassinated, but the handling of Reconstruction didn't really contribute to that reconciliation he had called for. It also took the United States more than 30 years to apologize for the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. And it was well understood. It was not like there was a secret what had happened, but the United States government didn't do anything about it until the 1980s.
Please.
Jean-Claude Chiuka, issue of war that's been going on in the DRC for almost more than 5 years. In this issue, we've seen that the international communities has turned their back to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mostly, we talk about the United States, we talk about France, and England and Germany. We lost millions of lives. And when we talk about reconciliation, now we are attacked by 2 or 3 different countries. I think later on Maestro Amang will speak about it. My question is, how can you reconcile 3 countries where the wound is too fresh and where people are not trying to sit on the table? Every time they sit on the table, behind their back, the international community is doing something else against the reconciliation process in this situation. And it seems like as much the United States is getting involved in this issue, they're making more enemies in Africa than in the rest of the world. I don't know, you talked about reconciliation. I don't know if you did speak about that part of the world as in a really critical situation about the reconciliation. I don't know what your advice would be in this issue with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda.
The Congo War is an enormous human tragedy. It's the single largest loss of life due to conflict since World War II. Right? And it's been going on, as you suggested, for many years. It actually goes back to the early 1990s, and in some respects even before that. And the bad news here is I don't have a simple solution either for the conflict or for how you would get reconciliation. In fact, that's going to be one of the most difficult ones for precisely the reasons you alluded to. There are divisions within the DRC itself, so there have been lots of bad behavior inside the DRC. There's been frequent intervention by the Congo's neighbors, right, for various reasons. Some may be justified, some not very justified, and so Rwanda and Burundi and Zimbabwe and Angola and others have all meddled in various ways. And then finally, countries like the United States and France and Great Britain and others have tried to do various things, I think often with good intentions, but not a lot of wisdom or not a lot of knowledge, and sometimes they may have made things better, other times they've made things worse. So you have a lot of different actors who have contributed to this ongoing problem, and how one is going to sort of come up with a complete understanding of that allows everyone to forgive and forget is beyond my level of intelligence. I think the one thing that you can say is that, and it's probably a general case, that reconciliation often is almost impossible to make happen overnight. People do not forgive and forget quickly unless, as I said at the very beginning, there is some compelling external problem, external threat that forces them to collaborate with each other, even though they might not want to, forces them to sort of put the past aside in order to deal with today's problem. But absent that, I think it often just takes the passage of time, precisely because, as you said, the wounds are very fresh, very immediate, and go very deep. And in this case, there are lots and lots of different parties involved. It's not just one.
Yes, but in the case of Ivory Coast, we've seen in the past a talented player by the name of Didier Drogba. He's from Didier Drogba, the former Chelsea player. Now he plays in China. So he's from the south, and they were in the conflict with another part of Ivory Coast. So after they won, they came second on the African Cup. By the time of President Laurent Gbagbo, he went and asked the president, he's saying that people from the north are our brothers, and us from the south, we are brothers. Why we cannot go play in the northern part of Ivory Coast, although we don't come along, although we are like fighting each other. But the president did allow the team to go play in the northern part of Ivory Coast without any threat, without any type of tension. So we are talking also as Congo. In December, we're talking about the Congo like it's something external. I think you being in doing research around the world, you had similar cases of conflict, similar cases of involvement. So we are trying to see like how the external thing can be resolved.
There is a sort of lesson in that story that at least suggests to me, and that's that it's probably too hard to expect a sort of complete political reconciliation, right? It's too controversial, it's too difficult for individual leaders to pursue, too risky. And so you often see it start with something symbolic, something low level. When the United States and China decided to reopen relations, what did it begin with? Ping pong, table tennis. We sent a delegation, they sent a delegation. You didn't try to resolve all of the differences between the United States and Maoist China all at once. You started with a sports team. You can start with cultural exchanges. Form an orchestra that has musicians from different parts as well. You're not trying to solve everything. You're not trying to attribute blame. You're just starting to do various things that convey, we're now going to cooperate. We're now going to work together. We are not going to, and we're going to discover that these are human beings on the other side who used to be our enemies. So that story may suggest that you start with something that's not explicitly political and try and work from that.
Okay, this is the last question, and I promised it to you.
Yes, my name is Marielle Bandi. I am a professor of criminal law from Greece and Fulbright grantee visiting scholar here at Harvard Law School. My question to you is whether you think there have been efforts of institutionalization of reconciliation instruments in the modern international affairs, so that it wouldn't be, let's say, a question of moods of politics at any time. And if you would allow me, I would like also to give a comment on the thought that you have expressed for the non-participation of United States in the International Criminal Court. I would say that this argument of if you just try to punish them, then they fight more and they may be even more dangerous then. So it would be of a better benefit not to participate. I think that one could also here make a counter thought, which would be that the international community, in fact, should be powerful enough or willing enough to make such fighting unsuccessful.
Okay, let me try and respond to both of those things. There are a number of mechanisms that you can point to in the international system where people have tried to institutionalize this. And as I said at the very beginning, I think the European Union itself contains a whole series of mechanisms that have been designed to reinforce that process inside Europe, including, as I mentioned, these joint textbook commissions to try and generate the teaching of a more uniform history. The fact that when Eastern European countries wanted to join the EU, they had to establish constitutional protections for minority rights, which was actually fairly critical. Lots of people were worried that there'd be this outbreak of ethnic conflict throughout Eastern Europe once the Soviet Union or Russia withdrew, and that by and large, with the exception of former Yugoslavia, did not happen, and it was in good part because a lot of these countries wanted to get into the EU, and they knew if they didn't manage that problem well, they would never gain entry, and that's, again, because there were these institutional mechanisms there. I personally agree with you on the International Criminal Court. My only point was that there has been an argument about whether or not it ultimately has the net positive or net negative effects to have this threat of prosecution lurking out there. I might disagree with you on the desirability of having an international system in which people who try to remain in power by force always fail, because the international system would all get together and drive them from power. And the downside there is that's also a recipe for sort of endless intervention, and I don't trust enough governments to always do it for the right reasons, that they will find reasons to go after governments that they don't like. It will also be the case that tyrants in weak countries will be in danger of being overthrown, but tyrants in powerful countries will get away with it. Because again, no one will want to start a major global conflict for the purpose of, say, spreading democracy or advancing human rights and things like that.
Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
So we'll take about a 5-minute break. There's some water back there. There's coffee back there. Ideally, there's some small snacks back there.
How about